Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of our If I Had One Wish podcast. I'm Crystal Hicks, President of Women in Social Housing, and today I'll be joined by my co-host and Wish Board member for the South West, Vikki Kirkwood. Hi Vikki.
Hi Crystal, I'm really excited to be here with you today interviewing Grania. So thank you for having me.
Lovely to have you, Vikki. Today we'll be discussing all things social housing, getting up close and personal with one of the UK's most prominent female leaders. Describing herself as a housing nerd and optimist, among other things, this woman is helping to tackle unprecedented demand for temporary accommodation in Northern Ireland, creating solutions to mitigate huge financial pressures on the country's homelessness services. Our guest today is Grania Long, Chief Executive of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, one of the largest publicly owned social landlords in Europe. Grania was previously Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Housing, National Director of the CIH in Northern Ireland, and Belfast Commissioner for Resilience and Climate Commissioner Co-Chair. Amongst a long list of other positions, Grania was the Chief Executive of the National Child Protection Charity in the Republic of Ireland and has served 2 terms as a member of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. She's got extensive experience in non-exec roles, spending 6 years as Senior Independent Director of Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing Trust. Currently, she is a board member of the Chief Executives Forum and Chair of Business in the Community Northern Ireland Environmental Leadership Team. Wow. Grania, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's lovely to be here and lovely to meet you both. Thank you so much.
Super. So as someone who was quoted as saying, I'm definitely one of the people who fell into housing, would you mind talking us through your career? And I'm really keen to know, what brought you into social housing and what's made you stay?
I suppose what brought me in is less interesting than why I stayed in a way. I was like so many young people who had a degree. So I did a politics degree in Queen's University in Belfast. And I spent a year after that as deputy president and then president of the Students' Union. And so I was like all of my other peers, kind of had a plan, had half a plan, but had no job. And so I applied for lots of different roles. And at the time there was a policy coordinator role in an organisation called Housing Rights Service in Belfast, and so I applied for that, and I think it was a 6-month role. I think it was maybe maternity cover, but it was certainly short term, very short term, but I was thrilled. And what I didn't expect was just how immediately I would completely fall in love with some of the issues that were being dealt with. So it's still around as an organisation. It's a really important advocacy organisation for people in housing need. Housing Rights Service, as it was called at the time, was an advice service, and so I would sit during coffee breaks and I would listen to the advisors coming in talking about cases. And at the time, so this was back in the year 2000, 2001, the kind of issues that were prevalent are very similar to some of the issues we still see today. Really acute levels of housing need, very short notice evictions from the private rented sector, usually very vulnerable people, the most impacted. So I was really appalled that mums with young kids would be given sometimes days notice from landlords who just wanted them out. So I just kind of fell in love with how to solve those problems. I think what I also realized was I was good at joining the dots between certain problems. So my job, was to take those individual cases and make sense of why policy change was needed, and then try to influence politicians. And so I wasn't brilliant at it at the start, but I built over time a kind of an understanding of how to take real stories and use them to influence change. So that was my first job in housing. But I suppose the reason I stayed and the reason I still do it every day, and I'm still, love it, genuinely love it, is because, well, it's really stretching. Yeah. It is, it requires you to, it's massively impactful. So you need to have an understanding of the human impact of some of the challenges that are faced by people that we serve. So I often talked to, when I was at the CIH, I loved the fact that the Chartered Institute of Housing was and still is an organisation that focuses on the science and art of housing. And when I'm talking to maybe young people who are just joining housing in their careers, I still use that phrase. So I love love the fact that the art side is the emotional side. It's the side that talks and speaks to the individual in the home, but the science bit is the technical bit, and the importance of that balance of both. So, my organisation, the Housing Executive, that's, in a way, that's my job as the chief exec, to make sure that we have a really good balance between the science of housing and the art of housing. And so I love the fact that, it does all those things. But I also love the fact that it's intellectually really stretching. Just when you think, you should never think you know everything, but just when you think, I've seen a lot now, actually here comes a problem, that you've never tackled before, or a shock to the system, or the need for collaboration. So, the climate crisis is now going to massively test us as housing professionals in terms of what we do about it, both on the mitigation side and the carbon reduction side and on the adaptation side. So I'm just fascinated by the fact that no matter how much you think you've learned and done, there's a road of learning stretched in front of us. So that's why I've stayed.
Oh, wonderful. I remember one of our other podcast guests said, it's just a lifelong learning journey being in social housing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's very clear your passion comes through, Grania. And I was just wondering, as an experienced female leader, that you must have seen the sector change quite a lot over the years. So I was wondering, what are the biggest challenges that you've faced, and how did you overcome them, and what lessons can we learn? Really, with the benefit of hindsight, what advice would you give to your younger self and others as a result of that as well?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, the sector has really changed massively. And I think I had a fairly unique lens because I was at the CIH for so long, and I was both the National Director of Northern Ireland and the Chief Executive. So I did get to see that kind of change happening from that vantage point. I think there's a number of things. I think one of the things that I'm really struck by now, and that I'm really happy about and pleased about, is how much less stuffy we are. I think how much more open we are as a sector, how much more collaboration there is. And I think there was certainly a sense that it felt at times at the start of my career quite exclusive. And I don't think it is now. I think I certainly noticed in my own job today the numbers of people, and I'm delighted to say young people, who are really, really interested in housing. That might be because young people are so impacted by the lack of housing, by affordability challenges. And so we have a generation of young people who are really values driven and who want to work in housing because I think they see the change that good housing can bring to people's lives. So I think, that's one of the big lessons. I think we're a much more open and more transparent sector now. I think we get that balance right much more between the science of housing, the focus on the human being, as well as on the property. And I think that's been really important. I'm still as passionate about good old fashioned housing management principles as I was on day one. And I think that's something actually the Housing Executive in Northern Ireland has always done well and continues to do really well. So, and I think we've learned as well, and we've learned rightly the hard way, that when we focus on one part of our profession at the expense of another, bad things happen. So Grenfell was absolutely a wake-up call for our sector. The death of Awab Ishaq has also been a wake-up call. We have had to search quite deeply as a profession within ourselves as to, the what would have happened if a case like that. And so when the coroner's report was published, after Awab Ishaq's death, I was driving from Belfast to Derry. I was going to, as it happened, a CIH conference, and I remember stopping the car, calling our Director of Housing and asking her to immediately commence a review. And the exam question I set her was, if Awab was our tenant, would he have died? And so we did an end-to-end review of every step of the process when a tenant flags a damp and mould issue. How do we behave? What do we do? And so on. And so that has been a learning exercise for us. So I think the big challenges for the sector have been when we don't get that balance right between science and art, or between housing management, asset management, development. I'm saying, I'm sure, what many, many people on this podcast have said before. But we have to constantly look outside of our sector and our profession and not think that we have all the answers. We have to look outside of the UK and Ireland and not assume that we have all the answers. We have to continually learn and challenge ourselves. So I think the big challenges have been when we haven't done that, Vikki, when we've kind of lost our way. And I think being honest about the importance of that learning. One of the things that Wish does really well, one of the things that all of those organisations who bring people together does really well, is give everyone the opportunity to ask those questions and ask them in a safe space and in a public place. Because if we think we can just learn in an isolated way. It doesn't work. We learn through discussion and through practice. So I think that's been some of the things that, some of the challenges. I mean, the obvious other challenges have been shocks, like the financial crash. I remember when I was national director of CRH in Northern Ireland, when I was chief exec, it was just after the financial crash. And so it was a massive shock to the system. And of course, the other most recent shock, has been the COVID pandemic. So those are the obvious challenges. I think we're going to have to get used to shocks coming our way. As I say, extreme weather events. We had a really, really significant storm in late January, Storm Éowyn, which affected Northern Ireland and Scotland, Wales and England, maybe to a lesser extent. I could be wrong. We were very focused on how the storm was hitting us. I think we have to get better at and be prepared to build more resilience to our system sometimes. I think that's certainly been a really important lesson. And I think the final point then is the biggest challenge. So, I mean, I love my job and people often say to me, what's the most difficult bit? And the most difficult bit is the obvious bit, which is not reaching everyone in housing need well enough all of the time. I mean, that's it, so for me, if we could do all of the things we wanted to do, if we could entirely eradicate, placing children in hotel accommodation, if we could ensure that every elderly person has the home that they need to keep them safe and well and warm and dry, that's that's the biggest challenge, knowing that we can't reach everyone, knowing that we're trying, knowing that we'll make every case for the funding that we need in housing and for the systems change that we need to do internally. But that's probably the biggest challenge. But equally, that's also the challenge that drives us. And I think that's the balance, not being overwhelmed by it, not allowing ourselves to become defeatists, but actually saying, okay, it's tough, it's hard, but it's harder for the person we're serving. So we'll have a bad day. We'll talk to whoever we need to talk to help us through it, but we'll get out of bed the next morning and keep going.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Really interesting. And I think, when we have these conversations with people, we realise, we're just reminded, I suppose, just how broad housing is as a sector and as a discipline, all the way through from sort of trying to do our bit around climate change through to safeguarding and community building. And, it's a huge brief, isn't it? I suppose that we have in the sector. You've talked about young people a few times, and I know you're a mum yourself.
Yes.
And I wanted to just sort of dig in a little bit more to your role around sort of the child protection space. So I know you have that role sort of with the National Child Protection Charity, ISPCC. And I think as a mother myself, child protection is definitely at the forefront of my mind, with social media use on the rise amongst young people and some of the sort of recent examples that we've seen around what social media is doing to our young people. Yeah, so just keen to understand, as sort of socially minded individuals that we are working in social housing, but also sort of housing organisations themselves, what we should be doing. What do you think we should be doing in this space to protect our young people and, I suppose, create safe spaces where they can thrive and live fulfilled lives?
Yes, I mean, it's the question, really. It's in many ways the child protection issue of our time is how we keep children safe online and how we help them to stay safe online. I started as chief executive of the ISPCC. It's the sister organisation of the NSPCC, so very similar organisations. And I started that immediately after leaving the CIH. And it was really interesting to me because I often say that I learned more about how we house young people in a child protection organisation than I did in all my years in housing. And I suppose in a way it does give you a different perspective and a different filter, I suppose, through which to look at problems and social problems. I learned a huge amount from running the service Childline. So Childline is the national listening service in Ireland. It sits within the ISPCC, and the head of Childline at the time, Margie Rowe, was this wonderful, incredible woman who'd been working in the organisation for years, absolutely dedicated to listening to children. And she taught me the importance of listening to children and how children need space. So oftentimes a child or a young person would ring Childline and they wouldn't say anything, sometimes for 30 seconds or a minute. And the job of the Childline volunteer was not to interrupt that silence, that there might have been a reason why that young person or that child wasn't ready to speak. And so I learned such an amount about listening and the importance of listening. My son might say, no, you didn't. I think I did. But what Margie taught me and what my colleagues at the ISPCC also taught me was in terms of keeping children safe or protected. And in a way, this is really reassuring in lots of ways that actually the kinds of risks that children face online and how we help children cope with them are not that different from any other risk. in terms of how we help children cope. The risk is different, but the coping strategy is quite similar. And so what I learned was, first of all, the relationship, the quality of the relationship between a child and a really important adult or adults is critical. And children who have at least one really, really high quality, good, reliable, dependable relationship with one adult is really important. That teaching children themselves how to spot danger. I think too often we don't want to tell children what it's going to be like because in case it will scare them, but actually speaking openly and asking them questions, asking them, how do you feel when that happens, helps them to spot signs of danger so they won't make the mistake of sharing information with somebody or whatever. And they also taught me, my child protection colleagues, that actually keeping children safe and keeping them protected is also about not allowing the child to be isolated, to become isolated, because people who have an interest in children, who want to harm a child, are always trying to draw them away from the people who love them and who are trying to nurture them. So everything that we can do to keep a young person or a child in touch with somebody, not isolated. And so if you apply those principles to any part of the virtual world or the real world, they apply in the same way. And so that's one of the things that I've learned. And so if you apply that to a housing context, well then in a way it brings us back to housing management, doesn't it? I have this conversation all the time in relation to women and girls in particular who are affected by violence. You know, people who want to harm women and harm children try to get them away from their community at all costs, try to isolate them at all costs. And so what we can do, and the part that we can play as housing professionals and housing managers, is to invest heavily in communities, is to create ecosystems within communities so that women aren't isolated, or so that we spot when somebody's trying to isolate a woman. We had a case recently of an older lady who had paid her rent on time every week for years and years. And one of our finance team realised that out of the blue, she'd stopped paying her rent, or she was paying small amounts for rent, but she was getting into arrears. And it turned out that unfortunately her son had been released from prison, had moved back home and was abusing her and was financially exploiting her. But it was, it was that brilliant finance officer who had been on the right training, who had thought about it and who understood. And so this individual, her son, unfortunately, a really tragic case, was doing his best to keep her away from everybody. And so, I think that I apply that principle of the more we can as housing professionals play a role as an investor in a community and bringing communities together and keeping people safe within their community, the less likely it is for people to be isolated. Once you're isolated, then people who have an interest in harming you can thrive in that environment. So I think you can take those principles of child protection and apply them within housing relatively easily. And that's what I've tried to do.
Yeah, really interesting, Grania. Thank you. I think, as a mother, I often reflect back on my own mum and how she protected me or tried to protect me when I was younger, So I come from a family of a lot of girls, a lot of cousins, I've got a sister and things. And my mum and our aunties would always say, you don't go anywhere on your own, you are always together. I remember my mum bought me a rape alarm when I was about 12, this blue thing. And I went in my bag and went off all the time. But I think they clearly knew where the danger was and tried to sort of guide me as a young girl in how to avoid that danger and deal with it when I was presented with it. And as a mother myself now, I think the challenge I have is I don't understand this online world. And as a parent, I don't feel like there's really any guidance or safeguards around it. So like my mother wouldn't have let me watch an 18 film or a 15 film when I was 10. But there just doesn't seem to be that certification or any of that framework around that online world. So as a parent and as communities, I think we're struggling a bit because it's like trying to navigate and protect children in the dark. But I think you're absolutely right, like picking up on those lessons of, well, how does it work in real life? How are we doing this in our communities and in our homes and in like an offline world? And how would that translate online? Really, really helpful. Thank you.
I'm particularly interested in that aspect that actually the providers of housing can be more involved in the creation of communities and how communities can look out for each other. It's that age-old thing, isn't it? The street I grew up on, the neighbours were looking out for each other's kids because maybe there was a single mum who was struggling to look after her children and go to work as well. So, if you can't look after your own children in a community, everybody's kind of keeping an eye on the well-being of everybody else. But then that makes me think about the people who are not part of those communities. And so if we can just touch upon the homeless outside of your involvement in housing, Grania, can you help us understand the extent of homelessness across Northern Ireland and how the NIHG purchasing 600 homes, for example, over the next 3 years might reduce temporary accommodation costs by, I think it was up to 75 million over the next 7 years. So the kind of bones of providing housing, but what that means for communities and homeless people as well.
Absolutely. And it's an area that, I mean, I worked for a number of years in Shelter Scotland. And so I didn't think when I was doing this job that much of my time, so many of my hours would be spent on the issue of homelessness. And in a way, you were asking me earlier about, what advice would I give to my younger self? Actually, one of the things that I've learned, and maybe you've learned too, as we get a bit older, is all of the things that you think you've banked, the progress you think you've banked earlier on in your career, and you think, I don't have to, that's done now. So, Equality Act done, homelessness, rough sleeping. Do you remember when we talked about homelessness being being completely eradicated, banked? And of course it's not the case. Now, I'm learning this now, but, of course it's the case that, all of those issues that we thought we'd solved or resolved are coming back. So I think the advice I would give my younger self would be, don't assume that progress is linear or guaranteed. And that just because you've been part of, change or, to a particular law or policy that, that's it done for good. It really, really isn't. It could be unpicked. And so you have to keep at it all the time. The campaigner in me, doesn't kind of rest, because those issues will come back. And so I shouldn't have been surprised by that, but that's the lesson I've learned, and that's the advice I would give my younger self. So in terms of homelessness, I came into the job in early 2021. So it was kind of past the first phase of the pandemic, and pre-pandemic homelessness in Northern Ireland was relatively stable. There were a stable level of presentations every year to the Housing Executive, and it's a regional authority. So it's a bit like Homes England, really, in terms of being the strategic housing authority, the housing agency. We're also a massive public landlord, as you said. So we have a number of levers at our disposal, really, in a way that other jurisdictions don't, to solve housing related issues. But what happened during the pandemic was both a supply shock and a demand shock. In terms of the supply shock, there was no churn within social housing, so people did not move. The new build programme came to an abrupt halt, just for a short period of time, but nevertheless that had an impact on supply. Our hostels, our voluntary sector organisations had to reduce down the number of beds because of the restrictions. So you had this really sharp tightening of supply very, very quickly. And then demand came at us at a pace that we hadn't seen. Because in Northern Ireland, the duty to provide temporary accommodation is an unending duty. So if you're homeless and we have a duty to provide temporary accommodation, that duty isn't exhausted until we find you a social home. So we had many people who were living in insecure accommodation, maybe sofa surfing, living with family. And when the pandemic hit, they were asked to leave. So we went from 3,000 placements in temporary accommodation a year to 11,000 placements.
Wow.
In a really short period of time. So the pandemic, without question, had horrific health effects, and some of those remain. But it had really, really, really significant and compelling effects on our housing system, which we probably less well understand, or is kind of less well appreciated, I suppose, by the public. So we had to move very quickly to, first of all, meet our temporary accommodation duty to a much, much larger group of people. And I suppose one of the things I'm really proud of is the fact that we kept a grip on it. And so we knew that even though this was really challenging, that there were still certain policy choices available to us. And two things that we did that have stood us in really good stead. The first one is we worked hard with the Department for Communities to ensure that our temporary accommodation was, as much as possible, own front door accommodation and high quality. And so that meant us leasing to private rented sector accommodation at scale. So we've done that now. We're now a landlord of 5,000 temporary accommodation properties. So I never thought I'd say that. So 5,000 units of temporary accommodation. We also took the decision that where we could, and you can see the child protection expert or former expert in me coming out, where we could, we would not place children in hotel or bed and breakfast accommodation. And if we did, they were for the shortest possible period. And that was a decision that the law did not require us to make. The department did not require us to make. But we just decided it was the right thing to do. And we didn't want a generation of children having to move school or having their childhood really, really deeply affected by long spells in hotel accommodation. So we set those two as principles, and we kind of set off into what we thought would be a year or 2 years, and we're still there. I mean, in terms of the demand. And in fact, demand continues to increase because after the pandemic, a different shock hit, the cost of living crisis hit. And so a different cohort of people came to our doors, mainly actually families who had lost their tenancies in the private rented sector because landlords were moving out of the sector. So we had a different set of challenges. And then more recently, we've had a small increase in numbers of households arriving in Northern Ireland for the first time and seeking leave to remain. And the Home Office has accelerated leave to remain decisions. So we've had a small but growing increase. So all of that has led to a what I call a systemic and a permanent change in temporary accommodation. So that has been challenging, yes. It has certainly taxed us and made us think differently. We've had to be very creative. We've had to build lots of new relationships with landlords in the private rented sector. We've had to work very hard to ensure that we don't place children in hotels for long periods. But we've kept hold of it. And I think we've kept hold of it because we kept looking ahead and thinking, right, what's coming around the corner? What's next in terms of those set of challenges? I think we did a pretty good job of predicting that after the pandemic, the next shock would be landlords leaving the private rented sector. So we watched the data very carefully and we slightly got ahead of that. When I say slightly, probably about a month. But nevertheless, that gave us the opportunity to say to the department, we're going to need more temporary accommodation at scale. We've now, since then, been able to do a lot of work looking at our portfolio, rationalising that, reducing down in certain areas, spreading our portfolio across Northern Ireland. So just staying ahead of it, gripping it, keeping some grip on it, making sure that we had control over costs, because as you can imagine, the Audit Office in Northern Ireland quite understandably wanted to assure itself that we were spending public money well. We've done all of that. We're by no means out the other side, but I think it is certainly an area that we have learned a great deal, and we have less than 2% of all our temporary accommodation placements, less than 2% are to children in hotels. And so, that's still too many for that individual child or families, no question. But we have set that very, very clearly as a target. And do you know what? I suppose the final point I'd make is I remember when I suggested it to our Director of Housing at the time, and to his credit, he went away and he figured out a way to do it. And he came back and he went very red in the face, and then he went away and he came back and he said, okay, I think we can do this. But actually it's been really motivating for our teams, because at times, when you can feel it's just too much, we can't see if we're making any progress. And every once in a while I remind my colleagues, this is what you did. You managed to significantly hold off the numbers of children in hotels. So as a result, there are hundreds of children, possibly thousands, who stayed in school, who stayed close to their networks, back to that point about being close to community, who we were able to provide higher quality temporary accommodation to. That's still not good enough. I understand that. But actually, it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative. And so sometimes you have to hold on to those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Grania, you described yourself as a bit of a housing nerd. I think we're getting that impression.
And if I call someone else that, I mean it as a compliment.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, like me, you're a dog walker. Brilliant.
Yes.
And an optimist. Definitely an optimist. So, I'm going to challenge you though. Are you optimistic about the future of social housing? And I suppose, what do you think we're going to need to overcome in terms of challenges to really deliver on those things we're optimistic about?
So I am optimistic about the future of housing generally, actually, and social housing. I think it's a strange thing to say, but I think housing has, because we've arrived at a point, and certainly in Northern Ireland, where the scale of housing need is unprecedented, or certainly in recent times unprecedented, that actually people now across the piece in every community and every kind of political party now accept that there are certain things that need to happen. So we need an all-of-government approach to housing, and our minister has just late last year managed to get agreement around the executive table from all the parties and all departments that there will be a really, really joined-up housing strategy and housing delivery on new supply. So that's really an important moment, actually, because that hasn't happened before. And I sit on the programme board for that work, and I now see government departments and ourselves all sitting around the table working genuinely, really collaboratively to find solutions on housing. So I'm very, very optimistic, and I think I'm optimistic for the governance of Northern Ireland and for politics in Northern Ireland right now. There's a huge amount of collaboration. There's a huge amount of just getting on with things and getting things done. And so the mood music is really good here at the moment, and it's great to see. I think I'm also optimistic that I don't think we're there yet, but I suppose if I had a mantra in my career, it's always been my view that housing is infrastructure. And that is a very nerdy, technocratic thing to say. But what I mean when I say that is it's social infrastructure, and it's economic, and it's environmental. And I think that when we forget that, that's when housing things go wrong. So, my organisation has 84,000 homes, and in the last year we spent close to 240 million on our homes. Now, we did that through our contracting partners, our contractors and their subcontractors and local supply chains. If we had decided that, procurement was too tough and the cost was spiralling, it was all just too difficult, and we said, we'll hunker down, we would have probably spent about 100 million. And we would have taken 140 million out of the local economy. And that would have been to the detriment of jobs, of supply chains, of all of it. So I don't think we talk enough about housing as an economic driver, not just in terms of new build. That's kind of the obvious one. But I think we need to get much, much better at talking about it's the door handles, it's the hinges, it's the fire alarms, it's the floor, the new floors, it's the new kitchens, the new bathrooms, the rewires, the electricians, all of that. I'm sitting at home today and, twice during this podcast have housing executive DLO vans driven past our house. We are a busy organisation doing good stuff. And if we didn't do that, the economy would suffer, society would suffer. And we're doing so much work from an environmental point of view. So I think there's no question that it's challenging. But I suppose what I've been saying to my colleagues, and we have, is, we have a plan. We know where it is we want to go to. We know what we need. We ask for help. I'm a great believer in asking for help. And so, earlier today I had a meeting with the new permanent secretary in the Department of Health, and we spent an hour talking about the things that I could do, my organisation could do, to prevent all kinds of health issues happening in people's homes, and all of the things that he could do to help build a case for housing and could help on housing output. And there's some really, really practical things. So we've seen an increase in falls amongst older people in Northern Ireland in the last year. And so we've been thinking about what can we do in terms of our improvement programme, a big £250 million programme, to prevent falls and prevent ill health. So those kinds of things make me optimistic, because I'm a great believer in kind of reach out and find a good partner and then be a good partner and, pay it back in spades. And so, I think that ability, housing is uniquely a problem solving profession. And for that reason, I think, you can always be optimistic, because you can always find the person who's solved the most recent problem and think, right, I can do that. And how can I do that even better?
Thank you.
I love that. Okay, so I have one last question for you, Grania, and it is, if you had one wish for the sector, what would it be and why?
So my wish would be actually that housing is understood as infrastructure, but I also would like the sector and the profession to say that more, and to say it in a way that's not always about talking, that the narrative isn't always about how brilliant we are, but actually how we're here to serve, and how in serving we have a really, really significant economic impact. We have a really significant social impact and a really significant environmental impact. So when I look at some of the work that my colleagues have done in the last year, keeping people safe in a once in a generation storm. And actually our biggest challenge we had the day of the storm was keeping my colleagues out of their vans and at home so that they would be safe. And they kept saying, when can we go out? When can we get the repairs started? And we had to hold them back for about 6 hours. And some of them were not too happy with the boss, because I kept saying, no, you're no use to me if you're, unsafe. So I think we need to continue to make the case for housing as infrastructure, but I think we need to do it in a way where the narrative is framed around how we serve, and that in serving our tenants, our customers, they are the better for it, but so is society more broadly. And so for that reason, we have set ourselves a challenge in the Housing Executive. In our current corporate strategy, which we're just about to launch, we decided that actually getting brownie points or kudos for doing housing well doesn't cut it. That's literally what we're here to do. And so we've set ourselves the challenge in our corporate strategy that in doing housing, we will reduce health inequalities. So in doing housing, we should be solving some of society's wider problems. And of course we do that. So we spent 69 million on adaptations in our properties in the last 5 years. It's an extraordinary sum. And when you look at the impact that has had, the profound effect, positive effect, I hope that has had on the lives of some of our tenants to be able to stay in their homes, stay in their community and be healthy because of that work. That I think demonstrates why good housing, profoundly, positively impacts lives. So it's finding that way to do it so that we are inspiring other professions, but also working with them and being a good partner. That's key.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. I mean, what an ambitious wish. housing is infrastructure. And spoken as a true housing nerd as well. Let's be honest.
I do well in that one round of the pub quiz, and I do really badly in everything else.
Grania, we could talk to you all day. Honestly, there is so much that we would love to hear from you on, but we've run out of time. So I just want to say a massive thank you for coming on to the podcast today and for being a champion for Wish and the work that we're doing in Ireland as well. It's really taken off, and we're so pleased with that. So thank you.
You're very welcome. And I am really pleased, really pleased that Wish is growing in Ireland. And I think it's really, really important. The work it's doing is phenomenally important. And it's just so positive to see more and more women actually spending time together and talking about housing and whatever else we need to talk about.
Definitely. And if you're a listener to this episode and you're interested in getting more involved in the work of Wish Ireland, then do get in touch with us, and we'd love to hear from you as we progress our plans. So Vikki, thanks for co-hosting with me. It's been lovely to have you on.
Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. You've been listening to the If I Had One Wish podcast.
Thank you everyone for listening to the If I Had One Wish podcast. Next time, we'll be talking to another inspirational female from the housing sector who will be sharing her career story and what she's learned along the way. And of course, we'll be asking again the big question. If she had one wish, what would it be and why? See you next time.